He thought he bought a ranch for $1, just land, dirt, silence. But when he walked through that old door, he found a woman who was never supposed to be there, and a secret powerful men had buried for years. What happened next? Guns were drawn. Truth was uncovered. And justice. It came riding in from the horizon. Stay with me, because this is the kind of Wild West story they never taught you in school. He thought he was buying a forgotten piece of land for $1. What Caleb Morgan didn't know was that he was buying a secret buried so deep it had spent years waiting for someone desperate enough or lost enough to uncover it. Caleb had seen the listing late one night, the kind of hour when the city goes quiet but the mind refuses to. 120 acres. Old ranch property, sold as is, first buyer, first claim. Price $1. That was it. No images, no backstory, no disclaimers. It sounded like either a joke or a scam, but something about it felt intentional, like someone had left the gate unlocked, hoping the right person would walk through. He hadn't planned to leave Denver, not really. He had a stable job building custom cabinets and window frames, a small apartment filled with ghosts, and a calendar that hadn't changed in 3 years. Not since the day his wife, Claire, left the house to go to the market and never came back. A drunk driver, a too-fast ambulance, a silence so wide it echoed. Caleb's world collapsed inwards, folding itself into the quiet grief of sawdust and nailheads. The only thing that had kept him sane was working with his hands, wood nails, angles that made sense when nothing else did. But that night, staring at the glow of his laptop screen, something shifted. He didn't need logic. He needed out. He drove 2 days straight to Deadwood, South Dakota, a town with history in its bones and silence in its soil. He signed the deed in a low-ceilinged courthouse with dust on the counters and a clerk who barely looked up. When Caleb handed over the single-dollar bill, it felt ceremonial. Like he wasn't purchasing land, he was agreeing to something much older, much stranger. The property stretched for miles, a rolling tapestry of tall grass and broken fence lines. The old house was still standing barely. It looked like someone had built a prayer and then forgotten to say Amen. The sky overhead hung wide and open like a secret waiting to be whispered. He stepped out of his truck. Everything smelled like sage and wind, and earth left untouched. But here's the thing. No one tells you about silence, it's never empty. The house creaked under his boots. The front door wasn't locked. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. Dust curled in the late afternoon light. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in curling scrolls. The air felt thick, like someone had just left, or maybe never left at all. Then he heard it. A footstep. Upstairs. Soft, deliberate. Trying not to be heard, his heart clenched. This wasn't supposed to happen. Carter Boone. Carter, the man who signed the sale, had looked Caleb in the eye and said, "Place has been empty for years. No one will bother you out there. It's yours, through and through." So who was upstairs? He didn't run. Caleb wasn't the running type, but he stood still, hand on the door frame, breathing shallow, listening. The sound came again. Floorboards, a creak. Then, silence. Then she appeared. At the top of the staircase, backlit by the faded light of a broken window, stood a woman. Young, early 30s maybe. Barefoot. Dark hair tumbling past her shoulders. A dress that had seen too many seasons. She didn't scream. She didn't look startled. She looked like she'd been expecting him. "You must be the new owner," she said, voice calm, steady, even kind. Caleb blinked. Yeah, I guess I am. Who are you?" She stepped down the stairs slowly, like she was moving through a memory. "Mae Callahan," she said. "I've been taking care of this place." For a second, it didn't compute. Caleb had bought the ranch for $1. It was supposed to be abandoned. Derelict. A fixer-upper not occupied. He stammered, I was told no one's lived here in years." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Boone Carter doesn't know everything. And just like that, the world shifted. He looked at her, not just at her face, but the way she stood in that old house. Like she belonged to it or it to her. She wasn't afraid, she was rooted. Worn down, but still standing. Like the house. Like the land. Mae explained that she had come here 3 years ago with nowhere left to go. That the house had saved her when nothing else had. She'd patched the roof, fixed the well, kept the wolves out and the ghosts in. She hadn't asked for permission because she knew permission wouldn't come. She simply stayed quiet and unseen. Caleb listened, heart-pounding in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. It was awe. She wasn't supposed to be here, but she was. And suddenly it felt like maybe he wasn't supposed to be here either, or, at least, not alone. There was something in Mae's eyes, a weight, a weariness, but also a flicker of something stronger. Not hope exactly, something older, defiance maybe, survival. She didn't look like someone who needed saving. She looked like someone who had spent years holding on to something precious, something dangerous, and she was just now deciding whether to trust him with it. Caleb didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a story about land, or gold, or ghosts. It was about what happens when two people, both broken in ways they don't yet understand, collide in a place forgotten by time, but not by memory. And somewhere buried beneath the dust and silence and prairie grass, a secret was waiting to change both their lives. Forever. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch, the wind cutting through his coat as the stars scattered across the black sky like broken glass. The silence was thick, not peaceful, not ominous, just full. Full of things unspoken, full of questions. Who was Mae Callahan? Why was she really here? And what had he stepped into when he turned that doorknob? At dawn, the sky painted itself with lavender streaks and thin gold ribbons, and Caleb rose from his chair with a heaviness in his chest that hadn't quite let go since he met her. The house was still quiet. He knocked gently on the kitchen doorframe. Mae was already awake. She sat at the old wooden table with a chipped mug of coffee in her hand and a journal lying open before her. She didn't look startled to see him. She just gestured to the second chair across from her. "I figured you'd have questions," she said, her voice low-edged with exhaustion, but not defensiveness. "I figured you wouldn't answer them all," Caleb replied. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Probably not." He sat. The table creaked under his weight. For a while, neither of them said anything. The air between them felt delicate, like the quiet before a storm, or the first breath after being held under water. Finally, she closed the journal. "I came here 3 years ago. Just walked up that same trail you drove in on. I didn't have a truck, didn't even have a map. Just a direction. I was running. But not in the way people run from mistakes. I was running from a lie." Her fingers brushed the edge of the worn leather journal cover, a nervous gesture that told him more than words could. Her shoulders tensed, her gaze locked somewhere beyond the window. "My father was a miner, Thomas Callahan. Spent his whole life digging into the hills west of here. Not for fortune, not really, for ownership. For proof that we mattered. He mapped every tunnel by hand. Every vein of gold, every dry shaft, every dangerous crack. He kept it all here." She tapped the journal. "He believed in facts. In filing the right papers, following the law. Said that was the only way folks like us ever got to keep what we built." Caleb could already see where the story was heading, and it made his stomach turn. Mae kept talking, the rhythm of her voice slow, like she'd told this story before, but never to someone who might actually believe it. One day, a group of men showed up. Slick boots, shiny belt buckles, false smiles. Said they represented Maddox Mining. Said my father had sold them his claim. handed over forged documents notarized by a judge who owed them favors. But we hadn't sold anything. My father wasn't stupid. He tried to fight it, tried to bring it to court. Her voice cracked for the first time. And then the mine collapsed. They called it an accident. But it wasn't. He was alone down there doing an inspection before the hearing. 2 beams went out at once, support posts he checked every single day. They buried him before he had a chance to speak. Caleb's heart thudded in his chest. He felt a familiar surge, rage, helplessness, the kind of emotion that sat deep in your bones. They took everything she said. Our house, the tools, the land. All on paper, legal even. But I knew better. I found this. She reached under the table and pulled out a rolled parchment bound in fraying twine in his footlocker tucked beneath a floorboard. She unrolled it carefully. It was yellowed, lined with delicate ink strokes, a hand-drawn map, survey marks, annotations in neat cursive, high-yield, shaft, unstable gold pocket. Caleb studied it. He wasn't a mining expert, but he knew detail when he saw it. This wasn't some doodle, it was a treasure map. But more than that, it was evidence. He kept the real records hidden, Mae said. He knew they'd try to take it. Knew they'd forge documents. This is what proves our claim. What proves Maddox Mining stole from us. If this ever saw a courtroom, why hasn't it? Caleb asked gently. She looked at him, then really looked. Not just a glance, but the kind of searching look people give when they're weighing whether the truth is worth the cost. Because they've been hunting me ever since. I left after the funeral. Came out here because it was the last place they wouldn't think to look. This ranch used to belong to one of my father's partners. He died years ago, no next of kin. The paperwork was forgotten. Boone Carter probably saw it sitting in a drawer and figured he'd offload it to some poor fool chasing a frontier dream. Never thought anyone would come. Until I did, Caleb said. She nodded. Until you did. He ran a hand through his hair, the map still open between them. The situation was beginning to take shape, and it wasn't a simple story of a woman squatting in an abandoned house. It was a buried fight for justice. A life lived in hiding. A war that hadn't ended, just paused. I don't want trouble, he said. Mae tilted her head. Then you bought the wrong ranch. He laughed unexpectedly. She smiled. I'm not asking you to fight it, she continued. I just need time. Enough to figure out how to get this map in front of someone who will actually do something. Why now, he asked. You've been quiet for 3 years. Mae looked away again. This time her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I'm tired. And because I heard something last month, riders asking questions in town. My name, my father's. They're closing in. And once they find me, they'll do worse than take the land. The fear in her voice was real. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just raw. Caleb sat back in his chair, the old wood groaning. He looked out at the land, his land on paper anyway, and saw it differently now. It wasn't just soil and fence posts. It was history, buried betrayal. It was Mae's sanctuary, and her trap. I'm not asking you to run, she said. You shouldn't have to, he replied. They sat in silence, and when the wind came through the cracked window, it felt like breath, the land itself exhaling. Caleb wasn't sure what he'd do next, but one thing was certain. This place was more than he'd bargained for, and Mae Callahan was far more than she appeared. The first sign of trouble didn't come with a shout or a gun. It came with the sound of hooves on dry dirt, steady, deliberate, a rhythm too calm to be casual, and too slow to be innocent. Caleb was mending the fence along the southern boundary of the ranch when he heard it. He looked up to see 3 riders cresting the hill, their silhouettes dark against the bleeding horizon. Dust followed them like a warning. He dropped the hammer instinctively. Something in their formation made his chest tighten. This wasn't a group of travelers. They weren't heading toward a town or passing through for water. They were coming for something or someone. He called for Mae. She was in the barn brushing down her old mare, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair pinned back in a way that made her look younger than she had any right to, considering the weight she carried. When she heard his voice, she stepped out into the sun without hesitation. Caleb pointed to the riders. Her eyes narrowed. "That's them," she said softly. "Or at least, that's who they send first." "Should we go inside?" he asked. Mae didn't answer immediately. She stared at the riders, watching them, the way prey watches a predator, not with panic, but with familiarity. "They don't want to kill me yet," she said. "Not until they're sure I don't still have the documents." Caleb's jaw clenched. "We don't have to talk to them. They'll tear the place apart if we don't," she replied. "They've done it before." By the time the riders reached the front gate, Caleb had already made his decision. He walked up the path, dust swirling around his boots, and met them before they could dismount. The lead man was tall and lean, his face creased from sun and sin. His hat was too clean for someone riding the open plains, and his belt was too heavy with iron to be friendly. "You must be Mr. Morgan," he said, voice slow, deliberate. "Heard a new man bought this place. Strange time to buy land no one wanted for years." Caleb said nothing. The man continued. "Name's Silas Creed. I work for Maddox Mining. We're just here on a bit of business. Looking for a woman named Mae Callahan. Heard she's been living on property that doesn't belong to her." Caleb didn't flinch. "There's no one here by that name." Silas tilted his head. So Mae stepped out from behind the porch post, then calm and composed her hands by her sides. "Don't lie for me," she said. "They'll smell it." Caleb turned toward her. "You didn't need to. I've been running long enough," she said. Silas grinned a slow, serpentine grin. "Now that's more like it. Always thought you had a flair for the dramatic Miss Callahan. We've come to have a conversation, that's all." "You came with guns," she said. "We came prepared," he corrected. "It's not the same thing." Caleb stepped between them. "Whatever you came for, you can speak from there. No one invited you onto this land." Silas didn't move, but his eyes flicked to the house behind Caleb. "We believe Miss Callahan is in possession of some documents that belong to Maddox Mining. Stolen, if you ask me. Your late father was careless with paperwork, Mae. Forged surveys, fake deeds cost the company a lot of time and money." Mae's expression didn't waver. "My father died trying to prove what he owned. You buried him before he could speak." Silas leaned forward in the saddle. "Be that as it may, we're prepared to search this property. You can make it easy, or we can make it loud." Caleb could feel the tension in Mae's body from where he stood. Her fists were clenched, but her voice stayed steady. "The only thing loud here will be the consequences if you step foot inside that house." One of the other riders laughed. "She got fight in her, that's for sure." "You've got no right," Caleb said. "This is private land. You don't have a warrant. You don't have jurisdiction." Silas shrugged. "The law out here tends to bend in the direction of power, Mr. Morgan. You'll learn that soon enough." Behind him, one of the riders dismounted. Caleb caught the way his hand hovered near his rifle. The air felt brittle, like one wrong word would shatter everything. "Let's not pretend," Mae said, stepping forward. "You're not here for conversation. You're here because you think I'm vulnerable." Silas's smile faded. "I'm here because you're still a loose end, and loose ends tend to unravel everything." Then, from the distance, the sound of more hooves. This time, they were coming fast. Silas turned his head, eyebrows narrowing. You expecting company? Caleb shook his head. No, but maybe justice finally is. They watched as 5 riders approached from the eastern trail, raising dust like a rising storm. Mae's breath caught. That's the sheriff, she whispered. Sheriff Hank Reeves didn't slow as he rode in. His deputies fanned out, forming a line between Silas and the house. The sheriff himself dismounted slowly, his face carved from stone, his badge dull in the low light. Silas Creed, he called out. You and your boys are trespassing on private property. You're also in violation of several warrants issued out of Rapid City, including intimidation, unlawful property seizure, and obstruction of justice. Silas's hand twitched. You can't prove a damn thing. Maybe not, Reeves said, but Miss Callahan can. And I've got 3 signed affidavits saying you've been looking for her. That makes you a threat. One of Silas's men backed his horse away slightly. The other cursed under his breath. Silas stared at Mae, eyes burning, but he didn't reach for his weapon. Yet. Caleb stepped forward. It's over, Silas. Walk away. Silas's mouth twisted into something dark. You think this is over? The Maddox brothers don't take kindly to being humiliated. You think they sent me alone? Reeves's hand moved toward his revolver. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. Either way, you're not walking away with anything today. The standoff held. The wind died. The sun dipped lower. And Caleb knew this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the line between right and wrong finally being drawn clear as day, and about whether they had the courage to defend it. The silence that followed Sheriff Reeves' arrival was more dangerous than the shouting. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the weight of decision pressing down on every soul within that dusty ring of confrontation. Silas Creed sat astride his horse jaw, tight hand still hovering near his holster, eyes flicking between Mae Callahan and the sheriff like a man calculating a risk he already knew was too steep. Mae didn't flinch. She stood steady on the porch, dust swirling around the hem of her worn dress. She looked tired, yes, but unbroken. Her eyes met Silas's and didn't blink. Caleb stayed beside her, his heart pounding, aware of every movement, every sound, every breath. He could smell the tension, gun oil, sweat, old leather, and it reminded him of the way the air changed right before a storm. Sheriff Reeves took a slow step forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. This doesn't have to end badly, but if you make a move toward that house, toward either of them, you'll be facing not just me, but the law of this entire county. And this time it will stick, Silas scoffed. The law? He gestured toward Mae. You mean the same law that let her daddy die in a cave-in while the company walked free? That law, Mae's voice cut clean through the heat. My father didn't die in a cave-in, he was murdered, and you know it. A low murmur rose among the deputies. Reeves didn't break eye contact with Silas. We have a witness now, Silas. A man named Peter Hardin. He was working a claim upstream the day Thomas Callahan died. Said he saw you and 2 other Maddox men tampering with the support beams before the shift started. Silas's smirk faltered. Just for a second. But it was enough. Mae's breath caught. Pete's alive? He is, Reeves nodded. And he's tired of hiding. He gave us everything, what he saw, when and how. Enough to open a full investigation and issue warrants. You're not just trespassing anymore. You're wanted for conspiracy to commit murder. Caleb could feel the ground shift beneath them. The lie that had buried Mae for 3 years was cracking open in real time. And Silas Creed, once smug and untouchable, now looked like a man realizing the walls were finally closing in. Still, his hand didn't leave his holster. So what now, he snarled. You think she's going to walk into court with a few old maps, and that'll be enough to take down Maddox? Reeves didn't blink. Those old maps are original survey documents with dates, signatures, and legal stamps. They match the land records registered in the county archives before Maddox filed their forged claims. You may have power, Silas, but you don't have truth. Silas's face twisted with something ugly. Truth never won a war out here. No, Reeves said, but it's about to win this one. Suddenly, Silas's hand jerked. In one breathless second, the barrel of his revolver cleared, leather, pointed, not at the sheriff, but at Caleb. Caleb barely had time to react before Mae shouted, and Reeves moved like lightning. 2 gunshots cracked through the afternoon. Caleb dove off the porch. Silas's bullet missed by inches and punched a hole through the post beside him. Then another shot echoed deeper, final. Silas toppled backward from his saddle, hitting the ground with a thud that felt like the land itself exhaling. Silence. Again. This time, not tense but stunned. A deputy rushed over. He's gone. Reeves let out a slow breath. Let's clear the rest of them. Silas's companions, seeing their leader fall, and the tide turn irrevocably disarmed without a word. One of them even raised his hands and muttered, "I didn't sign up to die for Maddox." Mae was still on the porch, frozen. Caleb climbed up dust, clinging to his shirt, his ribs aching. She looked at him not just with relief, but disbelief, like maybe it was finally over. Sheriff Reeves holstered his gun and turned to Mae, his voice softer now. "Miss Callahan, I'm sorry it took so long. But if you're ready to speak, if you're willing to hand over the documents and testify, we can make this stick. We can take it all the way to court." Mae nodded slowly. "I've been waiting 3 years to be heard." Caleb saw her hands tremble slightly as she reached inside the house and returned with the rolled bundle, the one her father had hidden under the floorboards. She unwrapped it like it was holy, and in a way it was. Proof of truth. Of blood paid and legacy stolen. Reeves took the documents, his expression respectful. "We'll make copies, take statements, start filing the indictments. The Maddox brothers are powerful, but they're not invincible." He turned to Caleb. "You did a good thing here, son. Most people would have walked away." Caleb met his eyes. She never ran. "I figured the least I could do was stand still." It took hours for the dust to settle, literally and figuratively. Deputies cataloged evidence, took statements, collected Silas's body, and arranged for the prisoners to be transported to Rapid City. Mae watched it all, leaning quietly against the porch, railing, her expression unreadable. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, bathing the ranch in golden light, the last wagon rolled away. Sheriff Reeves tipped his hat. "We'll be back next week to escort you to the courthouse, Miss Callahan. Until then, stay safe." Mae nodded, but didn't speak. When they were alone again, Caleb stood beside her. They watched the fading trail of dust rise behind the wagons. A warm breeze stirred the grasses. Birds chirped somewhere down near the creek. "I didn't think I'd live to see this day," Mae said softly. "You didn't just live to see it," Caleb replied. "You made it happen." She turned toward him. Her eyes were red but dry. "I kept thinking, when it finally ends, maybe I'd feel free. But all I feel is empty." Caleb understood. When you've spent years surviving a storm, learning how to walk again in stillness can feel like its own kind of terror. "You're not empty," he said. "You're just finally unburdened." She looked down at the porch boards. "I don't know what to do now." He reached for her hand gently. "Then maybe we figure it out together." The look she gave him wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something deeper. Recognition. A quiet agreement that the war was over, but the rebuilding would take time. And neither of them had to do it alone. The days after the standoff passed like slow-moving clouds over the prairie, quiet, deliberate, and heavy with reflection. The land was still but not silent. It creaked under the footsteps of healing. The echoes of the gunfire of the confrontation of names like Maddox and Creed didn't vanish immediately. They clung to the walls of the farmhouse and the edges of the old wooden fence as if waiting for permission to drift away. Mae Callahan spent the first morning after sitting at the kitchen table with her father's journal spread open before her. Her fingers traced the loops of his handwriting not to memorize them. She already knew every word, but to remember how it felt to be someone's daughter. The man who raised her had died trying to prove his truth, and now, finally, the world was willing to listen. But the justice she'd long dreamed of hadn't left her feeling triumphant. It had left her hollow. The fight had defined her. And now it was over. She stood up slowly and stepped onto the porch. Caleb Morgan was outside knee-deep in dirt, working on a post that had been leaning since he arrived. He had a shirt wrapped around his forehead, and his hands were dirty, but his face was calm, determined. She watched him for a while without saying a word, marveling at the simplicity of what he was doing. Fixing something. Making it stand again. He looked up when he noticed her and offered a smile. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said. "I was already up. You always get up early." "Lately, yes," she answered. "Feels like sleeping too long might bring the past back." He nodded. "I know the feeling." They didn't speak much that day, but there was comfort in the silence. Caleb spent hours reinforcing the barn's west wall and repairing one of the gates. Mae cleaned out the old pantry and started sketching a new shelf layout with pencil stubs she found tucked behind the flour sacks. The house had seen hard years, but beneath the dust and rot it still had structure, still had bones worth strengthening. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch together not out of habit, but out of shared stillness. Neither one of them filled the space with empty talk. They didn't need to. There was something deeply human in the act of sitting beside someone who understood your quiet. One night, as the cicadas hummed and the stars pressed close, Mae turned to Caleb. "What will you do when this is all settled?" she asked. He hesitated. "I thought I came here to escape things, build something that was mine. But now, I'm starting to think I was meant to build it with someone." Mae looked away. "I thought I'd leave. When it was all over, I thought staying would be too hard, too full of memories. But every time I step into that barn or open one of the windows, I don't feel haunted. I feel rooted." "You don't have to go," he said. She smiled faintly. "And you don't have to stay." They were both right, and they both knew neither of them was going anywhere. A week later, Sheriff Reeves returned to escort Mae to the courthouse in Rapid City. She wore her father's coat and carried the documents in a new leather folder Caleb had crafted from one of the old saddlebags. Before she climbed into the wagon, she turned to him. "If you don't see me again, I will," he interrupted gently. She paused, smiled. "Then, when I come back, maybe we can talk about that barn renovation you mentioned. I'll have the tools ready," he said. She returned 4 days later with wind in her hair and clarity in her eyes. The hearing had gone better than anyone expected. The judge had issued a temporary freeze on all Maddox holdings and scheduled a formal trial date for the following month. For the first time, the weight Mae had carried for years felt transferable. She didn't have to hold it alone anymore. The truth was out in the open, and it was louder than any denial. From that day forward, the ranch changed not just in function, but in feeling. Mae didn't just live there. She breathed there. She laughed more slowly at first, like trying out a long-forgotten skill. Caleb caught her once humming, while she swept the back porch, and it stopped him in his tracks. The sound didn't come from someone surviving. It came from someone living. Together they laid the foundation for something neither of them had dared name before. They rebuilt the barn not as a relic, but as a workshop and gathering space. Caleb carved shelves from reclaimed oak and crafted benches where Mae imagined children might one day sit and read. She collected her father's books and journals, cleaned and cataloged them, and began assembling a small library in the old storage room, adding a sign above the door that simply read, "For those who remember." They planted vegetables, repaired the windmill, painted the shutters in a deep shade of blue that Caleb swore matched the sky right before a thunderstorm. They argued about silly things, how many nails to keep on hand, whether goats were worth the trouble, and always ended those arguments with smiles and sore muscles. Neighbors, curious at first, began stopping by. Some brought pie, others brought offers to help mend the old road. A few brought questions about Mae's father, wanting to know more, wanting to understand how the truth had gone so long unseen. Mae answered them patiently, never bitter her voice, steady with ownership. She was no longer hiding, she was guiding. And then one evening, as the sun bled into the hills and the fields shimmered in gold, Caleb turned to her on the porch. "You ever wonder what might have happened if you'd never stayed here?" Mae didn't hesitate. "All the time. And then I realize I didn't stay. This place held on to me." He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "We built something, didn't we?" he said. "We're still building," she replied. It wasn't a love story in the usual sense. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. But in every board, nailed every meal, shared every truth, honored love had quietly taken root. It grew in the soil of survival and bloomed under skies they once feared. Caleb had bought a ranch for $1. What he got was something priceless. And as the first fireflies of the season danced around the porch and the quiet of evening settled over the land, two people who had once been strangers looked out at the future they'd built together. One fence post, one promise, one breath at a time. Some stories begin with a bang. Others begin with a whisper. But Caleb Morgan's story, his rebirth, really began with a single dollar and a key to a house no one wanted. When Caleb left Denver, he wasn't just escaping a city. He was escaping the silence left behind by grief, the aching quiet that follows the death of love, of purpose, of hope. He wasn't searching for adventure or even meaning. He just needed space to breathe, land to work, and somewhere he could begin again without having to explain who he used to be. That dollar ranch outside Deadwood, South Dakota, wasn't meant to be salvation. It was meant to be simple, empty, safe. But it wasn't. The moment he opened that creaking door and heard footsteps upstairs, everything changed. He didn't know it yet, but that house held more than dust and decay. It held a woman named Mae Callahan, and she carried a story that was heavier than the land itself. Mae wasn't a mystery so much as a monument. Not loud, not desperate, just unyielding. She'd lived alone on that land for years, surviving, hiding, waiting. After losing her father to corruption and deceit, after being robbed of justice and hunted for daring to protect the truth, she had every reason to turn cold. But she didn't. She endured. She stitched her life back together with her own hands, board by board, breath by breath. When Caleb met her, it wasn't just two strangers crossing paths. It was the meeting of two kinds of strength, one forged in silence, the other in sorrow. Together they uncovered not just hidden documents or buried secrets, but a shared resilience that neither had known they still possessed. Caleb, with his hands built for wood and steadiness, found purpose again in rebuilding not just the ranch, but a home. Mae, with her quiet fire, found trust again, not in the system that had failed her, but in the unexpected loyalty of someone who chose to stay. The arrival of Silas Creed brought the story to its edge. It wasn't just a confrontation of guns and words, it was a reckoning. Of past sins, of present courage, of whether truth can still triumph when power is so deeply rooted in fear. But truth, when spoken clearly and bravely, has a way of cutting through noise. Mae chose to stand. Caleb chose to defend. And justice, long delayed, finally found its way to the prairie. But what followed was not a fairy tale ending. It wasn't a sweeping romance or instant healing. What followed was quiet, real, earned. In the stillness after the fight, Mae and Caleb did what so few heroes in stories do: they built a life. Together they restored a barn and turned it into a workshop for ideas. They planted seeds literal and metaphorical. They turned silence into laughter, loss into learning, land into legacy. Mae didn't leave after the courthouse victory. She stayed, not because she had to, but because the land and the man beside her had become something sacred, a place of witness and rebirth. Caleb didn't retreat into solitude. He leaned into the shared life, understanding that solitude isn't always what we need after grief. Sometimes we need someone who understands our quiet. Together they found purpose, not in gold or revenge, but in mornings spent fixing fence posts, in evenings sharing stories on the porch, in the simple act of rebuilding something broken, not to make it what it was, but to make it something new. So, what do we learn from this story? First, healing doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes healing looks like survival, like staying when it's easier to run, like listening when it's easier to defend, like building with your hands when your heart still isn't sure it can try again. Caleb and Mae didn't overcome their pasts through grand gestures. They overcame them by showing up. Day after day, wound after wound, second truth matters, even when it's buried, even when it's dangerous. Mae spent years protecting a truth that was worth more than gold, not just a map, but the dignity of her father's name. And when she finally spoke it aloud, it didn't just free her. It changed everything. In our world today, where information is twisted and silence is often rewarded, her courage reminds us that truth has power, but only if we choose to defend it. Third connection is everything. Caleb thought he needed solitude, but what he truly needed was someone who could see him without explanation. Mae thought she needed to disappear, but what she truly needed was to be seen wholly and without condition. In a world where many of us feel disconnected, their story reminds us that it's not always the number of people in our lives that brings peace, it's the depth of understanding in even one connection. And finally, the past doesn't define us, but it does shape us. What happened to Mae's family, to Caleb's marriage, to that ranch, they were chapters, not endings. They were wounds, not walls. And by choosing to face them rather than flee them both, characters wrote a new story, one filled with patience, strength, and the quiet kind of love that endures beyond the last page. In a time where everything moves fast, where justice can feel abstract, and where healing often feels out of reach, Caleb and Mae's story calls us to slow down, to listen, to look someone in the eye and say, "You don't have to run anymore. We can build something here." So, if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of their losses, the courage in their choices, the hope in their future, then I ask one thing: subscribe to this channel, not just to support the content, but because stories like this matter. Stories about real strength, quiet courage, hard-won hope. Stories that remind us that even with $1, one choice, or one stranger at the door, everything can change. Let's keep building something true together, one story at a time.